Hi, in this episode I'll be talking to Phil Short about his epic adventures as an underground and underwater explorer. Over a brew, I speak to Phil about his long, extreme time spent underground, the planning and preparation that goes into these expeditions, and most importantly, the reasons why. Do you fancy a brew? Oh, hi mate, how's it going?
Yeah, good. You? How you doing?
I'm absolutely hanging out my arse, mate. I'm not going to lie, I'm knackered. It's been one of them weeks.
Well, it's pretty much the same. I got basically Croatia was incredibly hard work, and then every day I was there, it was looking less and less likely I'd get back, or I'd get back to 14 days of quarantine. So we were basically we're getting ready for a really big expedition that's going to be later back in Croatia in September. So it was like incredibly hot, like 40 degrees C, hard physical work, lots of diving, plus the stress of COVID and travel.
Yeah.
And then back, I've got some problems with my mum and her health, and then basically issues like that. So yeah, it was all a bit mental. So
yeah, well, I heard on the news thinking that we were. I mean, like, obviously, it's gone through my mind certain things we're going to talk about today. But I heard it on the news that the cabinet were meeting, or the health committee, or whatever they're called now, because they change names all the time, don't they? That they were contemplating Croatia getting locked down as of tomorrow. I don't know whether it's come out or whether they've...
It's not. Basically, as of this evening, the UK, the .gov.uk site still lists Croatia as on the travel corridor, but we'll see. It's day by day. If they do, it's not a problem, because this next job that is so big, the project have agreed to put us in hotels and quarantine us, so we can do the job and then do the same on the way back. But it will make for a long trip. If that happens, I'll be away for like 2.5 months. But it's a big job, so you can't really complain.
No, as long as they're paying, mate.
Yeah, exactly.
Matter, does it? As long as you get paid on a Friday, who cares?
Yeah.
So was it a good trip? Was it as much as you could? Was it enjoyable?
Basically, the purpose was to build some of the underwater working equipment that we need on the real job.
Right.
And test it to make sure it works. So when we get there, we're not like trying to put stuff together. It's now rigged and in a box ready. So when we get back there in September, we just take it out of the box, plug it in, and use it. So it was a recon trip, but it was essential and worthwhile. So
one of the most valuable lessons I ever learned when I was in the army was time spent on recce is seldom wasted.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you get all that, as they say, all your shit in one sock.
While
you're there, it's done.
Yeah.
So, Phil Short, welcome to Fancy a Brew podcast. Thanks for coming on, mate. Really appreciate your time. Unfortunately, you've not brought a brew, but I've got one big enough for us both.
Oh yeah, that's got a big mug. Yeah,
mate,
I do like brew. Anyone of my students who's trained with me in the UK will basically back me up in that I have been known as the brew monster. I've normally just never not got a cuppa in my hand. A lot of the inland sites, so I tend to get out of the water and one of the staff just walk over to me dripping wet and put a brew in my hand. So I get the concept. I just don't happen to have one with me.
See, I remember the first dives expedition I ran, and I was a supervisor on as well. So I was expedition leader and supervisor. And nobody brought me a brew. So the first wave had gone in, and I was on that first wave. Second wave went in, so I was supervising it, and I'm freezing. It was in Malta. At the side where the you swim out to the Farood, and freezing cold it was blowing a gale, and I'm like, I wish someone had just come down and bring me a brew. Nobody. It's the most important thing, I think, is whether you turn up at someone's house for a job and they offer you a brew, or when you're out on a dive site, you need to have a brew in your hand, don't you? Okay. Right, so do you want to give us a little bit of an intro to who you are, what you're about, and then we'll just crack on and see how we go on?
Sure. Well, my name's Phil Short. Thanks for inviting me to the podcast. I basically started my adventure, if you call it that, as in a variety of outdoor pursuits. Started mountain walking, single pitch climbing, all the normal stuff, after being sent on a multi-activity adventure holiday as a 14-year-old. And during that holiday, one of the activities that was available, that each day you signed up for a morning activity and an afternoon activity, and one of them, I think, on the second day I signed up for in the afternoon was caving, and this was in the Ardèche in south of France. So the guide instructor took us on probably what now looking back was the most basic and simple of dry caving trip around these sandy tunnels. crawling around and bits and pieces like that. But it just absolutely captivated me. I was just fascinated by these tunnels and the shapes of the rock and the geology. So ended up doing that activity several more times during that week-long holiday rather than doing all the individual ones. Got home and pestered my parents, like, I want to go caving, I want to go caving. Of course, we lived in Surrey. Not a lot of caves in Surrey. So eventually my mum ran the sports centre and said, for goodness sake, I've got this like annoying child. They said, oh yeah, basically the Guildford University Caving Club meet here and they're open to non-university members. So got kind of deposited there one midweek evening when they had their club meet, and they were really proactive and took me under the wing, and we've got to go caving at weekends every now and again. And as soon as I passed my driving test, me and a mate were like off. So we'd drive to Somerset, we'd drive to South Wales, we'd go to little shops and buy the guidebooks, and we'd go with really basic, military surplus clothes, old lightweights and old jackets, and basically, an old cap helmet from the old mine surplus and a helmet, and start just crawling in some of these simpler systems. And we were sensible. We'd like read the guidebook and choose the grade 1 or grade 2 caves, meaning no vertical, no water, no major hazards, and started sort of learning as we went along. And over the years after that, what inevitably happened is, following these caves, eventually I got to vertical drops. And I was like, well, I got no rope, I got no knowledge. So I learned how to rig ropes and rappel or abseil to overcome that problem. And then sometime later on, we'd get to a cliff underground in a cave and look up and go, well, I can't climb that. So I went off and learned to climb. And then inevitably, eventually, you follow caves far enough in the UK because they're active river caves. You get to water, you're then wading in streams, eventually you're swimming in underground rivers, and eventually the river meets the roof and you've got a flooded section known as a sump. It's like, what next? So the journey took me into learning to dive, to be able to join the British Cave Diving Group, to be able to go and see what was next after those flooded sections. And then that itself grew into opportunities to actually be going into places like that had never been visited, laying my own line and exploring. And it kind of just 30 years later, here I am. It grew from that.
Well, my first introduction to the CDG, I had done my side mount course with Gary Dallas, and he'd convinced me that twin tens split in half with the way for me because I'm only little, and I needed, the big Jubilee bands to put your clips on. And I ended up, there's a guy near us who I mentioned to you before, Mad Mark they call him, and he runs a little shop. And I said, I'm after these Jubilee bands for these cylinders. And he says, because I dive side mount. What do you dive side mount for? I'm like, well, I've just started, so I don't really have a reason other than I like the profile that they get in and whatnot. Anyway, I spent quite a while. We had a brew, surprisingly enough, and we got chatting. He was telling me about the CDG, and he was telling me about all this stuff and the fact that you're diving in wellies and like overalls and that. And it still to this day, I don't understand the concept. So my question to you: do you have fins on, or
Yes.
do you just literally get on the deck and sort of scrabble through and then climb out the other side? So, almost like evolution.
Yeah, it depends on the site. So basically, what you're doing, CDG style, I've used this quote before elsewhere, but it's the way to describe it. CDG style, what you're doing is you're using diving equipment as a means to cave underwater to get through the water as quickly as possible to more dry cave the other side and continue the exploration. The ultimate journey being from where the water goes in on top of the mountain to where it comes out the bottom of the mountain. And in some of those types, like on Mendip in Somerset, you've got two very famous caves, Swildon's Hole, where the first cave dive was made that led to exploration of a new dry section, and Wookey Hole, where the very first cave dives were made in standard dress back in like 1946, a really long time ago.
Yeah.
And basically that's when the CDG was formed. And in those caves, the underwater section is literally like crawling under your coffee table and shoulder to shoulder wide, not very muddy water or liquid mud, no visibility at all. And you do literally crawl along the floor, laying a thicker than normal line so that following divers can actually pull on it a little bit to help. And so there you'd be wearing a caving wetsuit, a harness to have the necessary bottles just under your armpits out of the way, that type of thing. It might just be a pair of 1 or 2 or 3 litre cylinders, wellies, a helmet light, and no fins. But then you progress up from that, you then start getting slightly longer sumps, like, for example, in Wookey Hole, the dive from the entrance, the resurgence, in daylight through to the 22nd chamber, Wookey 22, is a continental quality, really nice cave dive. Right. You basically get in, you can wear side mount 12 litre steel cylinders and swim comfortably with fins, with buoyancy, without disturbing the visibility, in beautiful passage through all the chambers, from the resurgence through chamber 1, 2 and 3, 4 on 7 and 9, the end of the show cave, through passing 20 and eventually at 22. But then you've got to take those fins off, wearing wellies underneath them, and carry all that gear overland through dry cave, and then another dive, then crawl all that gear through thick orange mud with all that gear, and then eventually you're then into a spectacular underground river system, where the river axe just pours down chamber 24, and you carry all that gear from there again to eventually get to the current dry end of the cave, the Lake of Gloom at chamber 25, and then from there it turns into what is now a 90 plus metre deep extreme tech dive, that was basically pushed to its current end by John Valantham and Rick Stanton a few years back, making it the deepest cave dive in the UK. But one of the things that attracts me so much to caving underwater cave diving, as opposed to technical diving in a big flooded cave, is what you're doing a project that involves multiple disciplines. So you'll need vertical rope work, up and down, known as SRT. You'll need horizontal caving skills. You'll need the ability to transition from dry suit to wetsuit to dry caving gear, depending on the thermal situation and quality of the cave. You may have to sleep or camp underground to get to the end, because it can't be done in a day. You might be using micro side mount rebreathers, bigger, more technically orientated side mount rebreathers, open circuit, back mount closed circuit, scooters, habitats, and wellies in a wetsuit. So you're actually taking all these disciplines, combining them. Yeah. And we'll chat about this later, but the biggest project I've been involved in my entire career and my life to date was back in 2013, where we spent 45 days underground and doing exactly that. We basically vertical rope all the way in, several flooded sections to build gear, dive through, strip it all down again to carry it on to the next diveable section. 4 underground camps that had to be provisioned, Everest-style siege tactics, Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, Camp 4, with a very big team to put an infrastructure in such that 2 guys can get to the end and hopefully explore new ground. Jeez. So it's that multifaceted, multidiscipline element of cave expeditions that got me going and keep me going. That's really what drives me for fun.
Well, this bit of conversation we've had now it's made me think slightly different about where we might go with this, because it fascinates me how you've just led me into that. It's not a thought process or a concept I come up with. So sort of stereotypically, like, we're going to Mexico for Christmas. We're going to go and dive with Lanny and Claire, at Underwater Tulum. So yeah, we're going out with Lanny and Claire. We're obviously not cave divers. We're going on a guided cavern dive, or guided cavern dives, which will hopefully spark that interest. Oh, my wife, no, I'm all over it. So hopefully we'll go down that route. But there's a sort of, how can I word it, stereotypical or a sort of given path into cave diving through perhaps TDI or other agencies that really do it.
TD, TDI, GUE, and the main cave organisation that it all came from is the NSS CDS.
Right.
So basically, the training standards that everyone uses pioneered down from a guy called Sheck Exley.
Yeah.
He wrote all the cave diving training procedures that we all now use in a book called Blueprint for Survival. Sheck was what's known as cave diver number 1. He was number 1 certification for NSS CDS. Tom Mount integrated that style of cave driving into what was IAND. IAND became IANTD, so they added a technical. And then over a period of time from the beginnings, TDI broke away from them, became another agency, etc., etc.
Right.
So if you make it like a pyramid, it all really started with Sheck doing his own thing, and then the formation of the Florida cave training organisations like NACD and NSSCDS, and the big technical organisations took it on board. So I'd say now the main ones doing cave training of the sort of technical agencies are TDI, INTD, and GU. Yeah.
So there's sort of two questions that come in to mind from that. I mean, I bought Sheck's book in light of getting ready for Mexico, just so I've got my head in the sort of right space to ask questions of Lanny or Claire. As a CDG member, what training do they normally go through? Do they have their own sort of syllabus? Are they like an entity? Is there much difference?
When the CDG was first formed, like I say, back in '46, they would do all training in-house. So basically an experienced caver would basically approach CDG members and say, I want to basically be involved. So they would do the basic open water diver training as well. Now they'd obviously tailor and orientate that open water training to prepare them for what was coming next, but they do it in-house. Over the years, what's now happened is when you're a caver and you approach them and say, I'm interested in joining, they generally say to you, well, look, go and get your basic diver certification, advanced open water, something like that.
Yeah.
Then you can dive. If you can clear your mask, you can swim without a mask on, you can clear a regulator, etc. Once you've done that, come back, and then you end up under what's called a mentorship system. So somebody will agree to propose you for membership of a section. Somebody else will second you for membership, and generally the person who proposes you becomes your mentor. So they're responsible to train you in the ways of the CDG. We have our own training manual. It's very much set up to train people to sump dive. Now, sump diving is what we described earlier. It's not what you'll find in Tulum. It's the smaller, shorter passages, caving underwater to get through them, as a means to more dry cave beyond. And there's some absolutely classic caving trips in areas like Somerset and South Wales and Yorkshire and the Peak District, that all they need is the basic diving ability to get through a 10, 20, maximum 30 metre flooded section, ditch the gear, and then you've got miles of ongoing cave that a non-cave diver couldn't get through. But nothing to do with ability or strength of character, just training and what you're used to. If you took one of the best, pure, perfect buoyancy, perfect trim, Florida or Mexico style technical cave divers and put them into a UK zero-vis cold water sump, it wouldn't be for them. And likewise, if you took a pure trained CDG sump diver and put him in a 30, 40 metre visibility flooded shaft that was 50 metres deep, and he's looking down and can see the bottom 50 metres underneath him, it wouldn't be for him. It's very unusual for people to do both. People that do both do exist, but it's not as common. So yeah, the CDG very much has its own training system to make people safe for diving in the environment we have in the UK. Because we don't have crystal clear car park entry cenotes in the UK. We've got some beautiful sites, but most of our sites involve a bit of bad viz, bit of cold water, and a lot of hard work.
So I thought it was interesting to ask that, because most people would just see what they see in the magazines, which is the stereotypical, what we talked about, like the Floridian cave divers or Mexico cenotes and all that sort of stuff. But to me, that hard work seems very much like your stereotypical expedition that I've ever been on before. Hard work, worth it at the end, but flipping hard work. So like the logistics of getting so much gear under that sump, and then you said you've got miles and miles of beautiful cave. You've still got miles and miles of gear to carry as well, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
It sounds horrific. So let's get on to expeditions and exploring. What is an expedition to you?
Well, I think these days the two terms, expedition and exploration, have basically become overused. A lot of people go on very adventurous trips that are basically, to an extent, following ground that has been discovered previously. And some of these trips are immense in the terms of dives. So they're great, great achievements. You know, there's places in France, for example, where there's a huge dry chamber known as bivouac chamber.
Right.
It lies beyond the second flooded section of a very famous, extremely popular, well-visited dive site called the Emergence de Rossel. There's a big organised car park. You get up and get in the water at the river. The entrance to the cave is in the riverbed, and you're flying through underground tunnels big enough for 2 articulated lorries side by side on DPVs with rebreathers. And after approximately 2.2 kilometres, passing 80 metres of depth maximum, with a massive amount of that 2.2 kilometres being below 50 metres, so a big technical decompression long distance cave dive, you arrive at this bivouac chamber.
Right.
Now, that place was first found back in 1998 on open circuit on a month-long expedition by Rick Stanton, Jason Mallinson, and a huge team of support divers that I was very fortunate to be one of. But Rick and Jason, on their own, once everything had been set up by the support team, went on beyond where anyone else had been and found that chamber. Now, that, despite being based in a very nice campsite on the riverbank in the Lot region of France, was an expedition, because unknown ground was covered and data was brought back. They surveyed what they found, they mapped it, and they brought that scientific data back for the institutions, for the CDG, for the world. Now, because of developments in equipment, in training, it is considered fairly normal for the advanced level of technical cave diver to go to that chamber during a week's holiday down to the Lot region. And what they're doing is they're following the line that Rick and Jason laid to a place that Rick and Jason got to, with equipment that is 15, 18 years more up to date than what Rick and Jason had available to them. And it's a massive achievement. You mustn't cut this bit out. It's an absolutely massive achievement. It's kind of like one of those bucket list things for experienced, high-end, technical diving cave divers. One day, when I've got the experience, the equipment, the hours, the time, and I'm ready, I would love to do that. Like wreck divers might say the same of the dream would be the Britannic. Yeah. But to go there is now not exploration. It's been explored. It's an extremely adventurous, very hard to achieve journey, adventure. Yeah. So I think, and Bill Stone, who's one of the legends of cave exploration, organising it, setting it up and exploring himself, he told me when I first met him and started working with him, if it's exploration, you're covering new ground and you're bringing back new data, whether that be maps, photographs, 3D maps, water samples, sediment samples, biological samples. Yeah. You're there to find new and bring it back. If you just go, get a quick snap on a GoPro, come back, go, well done, but where's the science?
I get you. Like
that. So for me and a lot of people that I've been on expedition with, and a lot of the true explorers that are my mentors and I respect, like Rick Stanton, John Valantham, Jason Mallinson, and bear in mind where you're going in Tulum, there's some incredible explorers out there doing phenomenal distances within the interconnecting cenotes. People like Patrick, and then the deep water guys throughout Europe and the rest of the world like Christoph, doing sub 200 meter stuff and exploring. There's some real genuine exploration taking place from the technical diving cave divers, and there's some real genuine exploration taking place from the caving sump divers. Yeah. But although they're both cave diving, they're two very different disciplines.
Absolutely, I get that, yeah.
And someone who's the best at one probably wouldn't even want to go on the other, and vice versa.
Yeah. That's funny, isn't it? It is a sort of massively different idea of how things run and how things are. Like that zero vis bit, I'm kind of used to that in the local quarry we dive in.
Yeah.
But it kind of. Do you remember? You must remember back in the 90s when Michael Burke used to do a show on BBC called 999.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah.
and I'm sure there was a potholer there, as they used to call him, and he kind of got stuck at his hips, and that's me. That's what I'm thinking. I'm going to get in there, be trying to snurgle through this little tiny restriction. I get my fat ass trapped somewhere. Someone has to come with a lump hammer and break my pelvis to get me out. So for now, I'm good. So at the end of this, I don't need an invite to the CDG. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, cool.
But your expeditions that you go on clearly are very, very high end, high level compared to what I've been on as what I would call an expedition, because that's what the military called them.
Yeah.
But where do you normally get your initial idea from? You know, so day one, week one of your exped.
Well, I mean, basically, if you go back to what we were saying about data. Now, my caving club I'm a member of is the Wessex Caving Club, based in Mendip.
Yeah.
Most caving clubs have got their own library, and now these libraries are mostly full of journals of all the caving clubs around the country, the CDG, and other things. And what journals are is when people go somewhere and notice something different, gather some data, take some new measurements, or even better, find some new piece of cave, they write it up, it gets published in their club's journal. And in those club journals, all the different clubs are members, publication members of the other clubs. So like in my club, there's journals from all the different caving clubs around the country and the CDG. So you go on a trip and you get to a point, you go, I wonder what's beyond there. You can go back to the library of your club, you can look it up. And what you do is you look it up and you follow it through the timeline from when it was first explored. Swildon's Hole being a big example. This is the water source of Wookey Hole, right, up on top of the mountain. First explored way back before the 1900s in tweeds and candles, rope ladders to go down the vertical section. Then eventually the pioneers and the founders of CDG made a homemade diving suit out of bicycle pump and an old Navy suit, and were able to pass the first flooded section, found the second dry section, which is a beautiful section of streamway. So from that moment in the late 30s, all the way through till about 5 years ago, when myself, a guy called Andy Stewart, and a guy called Greg Brock had been digging the 12th sump of that cave for 3 years, and were able to connect two pieces of the jigsaw at the very end of the cave and extend on to a new end point. Yeah. But we did that by reading what have the previous guys done. So you don't waste your time. You're not going looking at what's been proven to be a dead end. Yeah. But in those journals or on those maps, there's a blank area. You go look there, and you might be following the geological strata of the cave. You might be following the draft of the wind moving through the cave. Might be following the flow of the water, but you use the data that other true explorers have brought back to guide you where to explore next, which is no different to when, for example, Livingstone was exploring Africa, or Shackleton and Amundsen and Scott were racing to the South Pole that didn't exist. Nobody had been there, but they all went a few miles further than each other year after year until someone finally made it. Not one of them did it alone. They did it bit by bit over a decade. And it's exactly the same here.
I remember listening. It's funny you should say that. There'll be a blank space on the map, and you'll go and have a look there. I wish I could remember whose interview it was. It was definitely on Steve Davis's podcast, Speaking Sidemount. But he was talking about never, ever neglect the idea of just looking up. He said, because I've dived this particular cave so many times, and he said it just wasn't going anywhere. And then this one, for whatever reason, I just went, oh, and there was the hole. And he was like, cracked it straight through into the next section or whatever it was.
Yeah. It sounds like a story I've heard before from another friend of mine from cave diving, Brian Kaycock.
Right.
One of the two systems that he connected on the Bahamas that was found in exactly that way. He'd been going back over old ground that, funnily enough, the first exploration in the Bahamas was done by CDG members, Rob Palmer, Rob Parker, Martin Farr.
Yeah.
And basically Brian is Mr. Bahamas now. He's basically explored most of what's there, along with Christina Zanato.
Yeah.
They connected something by exactly that process, like, looking in the unexpected place. And it's not uncommon, because people who are used to being on the surface, climbing mountains or whatever, it's a terrible thing to say, but it's kind of two-dimensional. Cave is totally three-dimensional. And when you think the reason the tunnels are there is because the water from rain is mildly acidic because of the carbon dioxide, and limestone the caves are made of can be dissolved by a mild acid. And of course, that dissolution process will take away the weakest rock first. So you end up with these bizarre tunnels that go up, down, left, right, back on themselves, over themselves, under themselves. So yeah, if you think it's the end, look up, look left, look right, look down, look back behind you and see if there's a dog leg going back right where you just came from. Definitely.
Say you've got your idea now then, where'd you go with your planning to sort of gather your troops, if you will, because obviously it's a massive logistic, I'd say nightmare, the amount of people you need to get on that one I heard you talk about. It was a 3-month trip, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, J2 was a 3-month trip. We were in the jungle for 3 months. It took at least the first 2 weeks to transport all the gear from the ranch, which is the last place you can get a 4-wheel drive, up to the top of the mountain by donkey and by human. And then top of the mountain, we established base camp. And then from base camp, we cut a trail through the jungle down to the cave entrance. And then you slowly start dropping down the ropes into the cave. The ropes have to be put in by the rigging team first, and transporting the gear down. About a kilometre of rope down into the cave vertically, you arrive at the site of what's called Camp 2A, and that becomes like a big hub. And then teams from Camp 2A start to move that gear again as far as Camp 3, again from Camp 3 to dive base. Eventually then the dive gear is built, the dry boxes, tubes and bags are packed with what's needed, and then the dive team dive through that flooded section, which in this case happens to be sump number 2. Number 1 is bypassable. And then once they're the other side of that flooded section, they're on their own. So they then have to strip all that gear down, disassemble it all again, put it back in, carry bags, carry boxes, and then transport it, in this case, another kilometre to the next flooded section, rebuild it all again, dive it through that one, and continue. So this was a project made up of over 50 people from 15 nationalities. Not every one of those 50 was there for the whole 3 months. There was a huge number of people at the beginning to rig the cave and transport gear. A moderate number of people in the middle when the exploration was going on, because apart from the explorers, for the rest of the team, that's really a quiet period, apart from resupplying food and fuel and batteries. And then at the end, another huge influx of people to clear all the gear out of the cave again. And this is very similar to an old-style siege method Himalayan mountain climb, as done by John Hunt when Hillary and Tenzing Norgay got to the summit of Everest. It wasn't 2 guys, it was like 50 guys. And it's the same. Where it comes from is the project leader of that project, a guy called Bill Stone. He's been working in that mountain range south of Mexico, close to the border of Guatemala, near a big city called Oaxaca. And he's been working in that mountain range in 3 main caves, J2, which we were in, Cheve, which is next door, and across the valley, Huatla. And while we were there, working on Bill Stone's beginnings of 4 decades, another British CDG member, Chris Jewell, was running his own expedition in Huatla to try and extend Bill's previous end there, which they achieved because Jason Mallinson was a team member and he managed to dive the terminal sump to technical diving limits. I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the 80-metre range of water depth, which you keep adding all the distance from when you go into the cave, down a rope, horizontal doesn't count, down another rope, come up a bit, that doesn't count, down a rope to the previous level doesn't count, then continue. And if you dive, the depth of the dive counts, and you're looking for, from the entrance to where you've got, the depth. Currently, the deepest cave in the world, measured by how far a man can get, is a thing called Voronya in the Russian Federation, Georgia border area. And it's believed, I've never been, but it's everyone you speak to has been, is it's unbelievably small, sharp rock, thick mud, The dives are in absolutely zero viz. Carrying the gear is an absolute nightmare, but it is the deepest cave in the world at this time. There are places on the planet where the geology and the hydrogeology would indicate that if a connection could be made from where the rain first goes in up on top of the mountain to where it's known to come out in a river at the bottom of the mountain, that would be the deepest cave on the planet. But it doesn't count until they're connected.
That one sounds right up your street, though. No viz, loads of hard work.
It's I'll tell you what, it's right up the hard work threshold of Russians. I've been very lucky to do 4 cave diving expeditions to the Urals and 2 to the Caucasus Mountains of the Russian Federation with Russian teams as a guest diver, and they are on another level of hard. It's inconceivable. You know, the gear they lug, the conditions they lap up and put up with.
Did you crack on with it?
Crack on with it, yeah.
Wow.
You know.
So how do you go on for funding for all that? It must be in the planning phase, just taking it back slightly from the point where we're in the water now, but in that planning phase, there must be so much work that goes on, like years, if not months. 2
questions there that you asked. We'll start with the first one was the funding. So basically, the majority of these projects are self-funded by incredibly enthusiastic and driven individuals. So CDG guys put on a project. They basically pay their own flights, pay their own accommodation, such that it is. The equipment manufacturers through the industry are incredibly generous. We couldn't do it without them. None of them are in a position to provide athlete-style financial support, but they pull out the stops to supply us with the gear we need. Especially when you consider most of these projects destroy all the gear, so it's not coming back. But something like J2, for example, Santi, the dry suit manufacturer, custom made a special type of dry suit for that project. Fourth Element worked together with a specialist company in the US called Cupron and the fleece company Polartec to custom make antimicrobial underwear for us for the project. So you get project funding in the sense of equipment and that type of thing.
Yeah.
But with regards to flying to Mexico to go on a project like that, each person pays their own flight. The food bill is generally pretty cheap, but basically the project manager will say, right, for 3 months in the field with 50 people, we need X 100 kilos of dehydrated potato, pasta, rice, dehydrated vegetables, blah, 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 blah. They buy the whole lot. They drive it down over the border from the US to site in trucks. And then everyone who goes chips in. So you might say, it's $5 a day.
Right.
Some of the bigger ones, like J2, had funding from 2 sources. One, Discovery Channel's documentary series, Curiosity, decided they wanted to come and film the project. For legal and insurance reasons, the film crew weren't allowed in the cave, so they filmed all the outside stuff, all the jungle stuff, all the entrance stuff, the interviews, and then they sent us underground with cameras that they supplied and audio sets that they supplied to make the rest of the documentary, and it worked. They made a really good 45-minute documentary for Discovery Channel, and they as their contribution, they picked up the food bill for the whole team for the whole 3 months.
That's brilliant.
NASA were involved in that project because they were interested in the effects of psychological stress from being contained in an enclosed environment without sunshine for long periods. My longest single trip underground on that project was 21 days. So they were interested in how that would affect people nutritionally, psychological health-wise. So we did saliva sampling for them to take measurements and what have you. And they put in some funding because of that. There are projects where a little bit of outside funding comes in, but I have to emphasise most of these big projects that come off and achieve great finds, like the stuff that Christoph has done around the world in very deep water, like the stuff Patrick has done in Mexico to interconnect the cenotes of the Tulum region and beyond, and like the stuff that Rick and Jason John have done all over France and Europe and beyond. they put it together themselves, they fund it themselves, and then like-minded other members of the CDG who, we all know our place. We know I'm capable of this, therefore I can support these guys to here. A new member might be capable of this, but each person's contribution makes the whole happen. If the support team weren't there, in most of these projects, the exploratory team would never get to the end, let alone achieve it.
So your after-action review, when you're getting out from doing that sort of project or that expedition, in what way do you put your data together and have like a published document or a published article or whatever it might be?
Well, I mean, on a cave expedition like that, the most important data is the survey data. So when you're exploring new ground in a really simplistic way, whether it be dry or underwater, you at each what's called a survey station, and they've got to be within sight of each other. You need a compass bearing of where it's going next. If it's rising or dipping, you need a clinometer reading of the incline angle, up or down. If you're underwater, that's easier because you can use the depth. So I'm at position 4, it's 10 meters deep. You then go to position 5 and it's 15 meters deep. There's a 5 meter depth difference over a 5 meter horizontal distance. It's just trigonometry as to how that applies. So that's fairly easy. And then at each of those points, as well as the forward bearing direction, and you normally take a back bearing as well to cross-reference your last one, you then take a measurement from that point to the left, the right, up to the roof and down to the floor, LRUD, left, right, up and down. So you'll take all of those measurements to give you the dimensions of the passage at that point, and then this is then grouped together. So you'll come out of the cave with bearing, depth, left, right, up, down, and maybe if you have the time or the ability or the visibility, a sketch. And on J2, we had radio contact back to base camp. So we were able, in an evening after a dive, bear in mind the diving area of the cave was with gear about a 3-day journey from the entrance. But you could get on the radio at the 9 p.m. call and you could read all that data out. And then the surface team in base camp up in the jungle could be logging that into the PCs. So the map was being drawn daily. And that's brilliant because then if an error comes up, the next day on the 9 a.m. radio call, and say, can you just go back through the numbers? Because there seems to be a really weird thing going on survey station 42. And you read it back and go, there you go, there's the mistake. We thought you said 21, it's actually 12. Or actually, guys, can you go back in and get that data again? Rather than 3 months later, you get home and finally log it and you're like, oh my God, we can't do that. So survey data is important. The higher the accuracy, the better. And then obviously each person keeps a journal of their daily events, their daily tasks. The expedition leader, in this case Bill Stone, keeps a logistics log of the events.
Almost like a captain's log on a ship.
Yeah, exactly. Like how much food needs to be at which camp at what time. So the whole group of people, on a rigging period at the beginning of the trip, there might be 25 people underground at a given time. They've all got to eat. You mentioned the the chefs and the wages clerks and the equipment suppliers in the army. It's pretty much the same. It runs in a very military style. An army marches on his stomach. If you stop feeding these guys, they're not going to carry your cylinders any further.
Well, that's it. Your reports and returns in that respect are quite important. But I don't want to go too morbid on this bit, but we kind of have to ask the question. If you're 3 days down and something goes wrong, one might assume that you, as a group together, must have some real medical kit and some sort of real practices in place to sort out whatever might likely go wrong at that point.
You're right to say let's not be morbid, but we also have to be realistic. I think basically people that involve themselves in the cutting edge of extreme exploration have to be aware and accept and acknowledge and agree and be open within the team that if you were the end of J2 was just over 12 kilometres horizontally from the entrance and just over 1.2 kilometres vertically on rope from the entrance. The end of J2 was beyond 2 flooded sections. The first relatively straightforward, 200 metres long, 12 metres deep, by cave diving standards, that's small. By sump diving standards, that's quite big. But sump 4, which is the one we explored, turned out to be 600 metres long and 20 metres deep, which again, by world technical cave diving standards, is nothing now. 2+ kilometre sumps are normal. Pozo Azul, again, Rick Stanton, Jason Mallinson, John Valantham and others, is over 9 kilometres. But when you take a 600 metre long sump and put it at the end of 12 kilometres of caving, it basically grows in the enormity. The point being, when you get out of the water the other side of that sump, you're then on new rock, fresh mud, untested, untrodden. Some of it is fracture prone, loose. So if you slip and break an arm, that is going to be a unbelievable rescue operation to get that person back to the dive gear, in the dive gear, dived back through a 600 metre sump, across another kilometre of dry cave, move all their gear for them, back in the gear, dive them out of the second sump, and then you're at a place where the team paramedic with the massive paramedics first aid kit can come down from Camp 2 or Camp 3 where he is and effect a decent repair on a broken arm, and then the team would self-rescue that individual back out to the surface before going on to hospital. If that wasn't an arm, but it was a vertebrae or a pelvis or a neck, then you do have to accept that the likely scenario in that remote a place is, it's like saying if Armstrong on the moon had ripped the suit, it's not like, well, we'll just pop down the shop and buy a patch. In those sort of extremely remote environments, you do have to accept the possibility. You don't go looking for it and you don't make it easier, but you have to accept the possibility. And obviously on expeditions, and we're not going to dwell on this, and I'm certainly not going to go into details, but over the history of cave diving, as in sump diving, caving expeditions with flooded sections to pass, be they short or long, over the years, the 50, 60 years that CDG members and others have been doing this type of thing, of course fatalities have happened. From the amount I've read and the people I know, I think almost none of those fatalities occurred through foolishness, recklessness, or malpractice. They just occurred because, if you look through the history of pioneers of anything, whether it be mountain climbing, caving, cave diving, avionics, aerospace, any of these things, losses are made to make progress. Tragically, but
you're always prone to an accident or something going wrong if you're pushing the envelope just that bit too far. It's always likely, isn't it? But risk versus reward, isn't it? It might not happen, and you might find the next thing. So,
but joking aside, I felt 3 months on the project, I felt far more at risk trying to find a street taco in Mexico City on the way there than I did at any point in the expedition.
Well, let's get back on to sort of nicer things then. Maybe. How did you find the jungle? Because anything I've ever seen or read or heard, that jungle just wants to attack you and eat you and not like you. Well,
firstly, the type of jungle in southern Mexico up in the mountains is kind of a version of what they call cloud forest. It's secondary, it's above the slash and burn of the agriculture, thick canopy, so there's no daylight in base camp, but it's quite cool, quite high rainfall. You're most of the time in the clouds, so the number of things that are routinely trying to bite you, sting you, poison you, or otherwise ruin your day are fairly minimal. I've been in real jungle. I spent 6 weeks in the primary rainforest of Borneo many, many years back now, and what they say about jungle there is very much true. Everything is either poisonous, will sting you, bite you, give you a rash, poison you, or all of the above. And it's an incredibly, for an indigenous local, like an Ibn in that area, it's paradise because there is so much food. But if you eat the wrong thing, you're dead. So, we go to it, and it's a highly threatening environment for the locals, the indigenous peoples. It's their home. You're permanently wet. You're permanently dirty. If you were to bother having a wash 30 seconds later you sweated so much you're stinking again. Most of the J2 team during the 3 months were more comfortable, slept better and ate better when they were underground than when they were in the jungle camp.
I bet they did.
Yeah.
Well, one last question then. When you have to go and drop the kids off at the pool,
yeah,
I'm assuming you're carrying that out all the time, are you?
Well,
are you just finding a cheeky little rock that no one's staring at? There's no light behind.
It's interesting because, you know, like astronauts always say, the first question that anyone asks is how to go to the toilet in space. In cave, there are hermetically sealed, pristine ecosystems in caves like the very famous Lechuguilla cave in the Americas, where the environment is so pure and there is no water flow. There hasn't been for millions of years since the cave was formed. In those environments, they do poop in bags and put it in tubes, pee in bottles and bring it all out. What happens in the big river caves, which will definitely flood every wet season, we do these projects in the dry season, is each camp's latrine is situated well below the flood season's flood zone.
Yeah.
So, and you know it works because when you go back the year after or 2 years after, you go to the exact same spot for the latrine, but there's nothing there other than clean sand and sediment. Yeah. We do dispose of the paper, so all that's left is actually the number 2 or the number 1.
Yeah.
Not the chosen method.
So the organic, the organic matter as such.
And the main reason for that is because of it's very difficult to be hygienic. It's very difficult not to get sore in various areas. So generally, you're using nice luxury wet, medically treated paper, which doesn't burn and doesn't degrade. So you use that, you put that in a bag, that all comes out, but the number 2 stays. When it floods, it carries on. And it's obviously very carefully set up in the expedition that it is way downstream of where the drinking water is collected. It's way downstream of where the pan washing location is. And it's with regards to where it ends up long term, you've got about 5 kilometres of missing cave through porous limestone before this river exits and goes out through it. So it's the ultimate filter. It's like putting it through a massive rock filter. So that's how it's handled in this cave, but in different caves it's handled in a different way.
Right. Definitely. Last question, Phil. I know we're stuck for time and that, but when you say hermetically sealed, how do you go on for breathing? And do you take? Clearly, you've got breathing apparatus. I get that.
Yeah. It's a really good question, and it's again another one that's asked all the time. Now, we very much clarify here that for the purposes of answering your question, we're talking about natural limestone caves, not mines, and not maybe tunnels that are formed by rapid volcanic action. So we restrict ourselves in answering that question to natural limestone caves.
Okay. Limestone
is basically porous. The cracks in it, made by tiny amounts of rainwater dissolving through, are verging on microscopic. We can't see them or get into them or through them, and neither can anything else. But what happens is the acidic nature of rainwater will eventually open up these cracks within the sedimentary layering of the limestone and turn them into tiny channels. And when I say tiny channels, I mean smaller than a drinking straw.
Yeah.
Once that tiny channel exists, the next rainstorm won't have to dissolve that hole. It will be able to flow through it. And much like a river, when water flows, it erodes. So a genuine cave system is formed firstly by dissolution, dissolving, and secondly by erosion. Over 1 million years, that erosion makes that drinking straw-sized tube bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until, like the Rosselle in France, it's the size big enough for 2 articulated lorries to drive down.
Yeah.
And whereas you might find a hole in the floor the size of a scallop shell, and in that hole in the floor a pebble the size of a pea, and during a flood the pea will be spun in that hole, grinding away the rock, making that scallop-shaped pothole deeper.
Yeah.
And then they are called scallops because there's scallop shapes in the floor that makes it look like pummeled metal.
Yeah, I've seen them in Gibraltar, yeah.
Yeah, and some of the big ones in somewhere like Rossell will be big enough to park a car in, and the rock in the bottom is not a pea, it's a fridge. And in the big floods, they're spun round to carve these holes. So back to your question, in a river cave, the water coming in from the surface of the mountain, a bit like our bodies when we dive, that water is at the same level of oxygen and nitrogen as the air we're in. So that oxygen in the water is carried down into the cave and will then come out of the water into the air spaces of the cave until they're equal. If some of that is used up over time, it gradually replaces. It's just this process.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the rock itself is generally porous. So unless you're talking because there have been incidents and people will read up and say, oh, what about this? If you're in a tiny air pocket, even in a limestone cave, and 3 of you are in there for 20 minutes, you're going to breathe all the oxygen and fill it with carbon dioxide. It becomes dangerous. But only till the next water flows through or the next flood, or it reprovisions itself. If you've got a huge chamber the size of a shopping mall, 3 people breathing in it won't make a difference. And what limestone has within it, through complex processes under hot conditions like very hot summer and a cave that's a shallow depth under the surface, the limestone can release and make the environment quite high in CO2, basically just so that you breathe a little bit faster than normal. You notice it, but it's not inherently immediately dangerous. Tinier chamber, it could be, but mines, which is why we're not going to touch on those here, you've got to know what rock they were mining in and for what, because some of these rocks give off toxic gases. And there have been fatalities of technical divers diving in mines, surfacing, taking out the mouthpiece to walk around for a look, and becoming unconscious instantly.
Yeah, that's what sort of spurred my question on.
Very, very different in a mine. Very, very different in a mine, or inside an air pocket in a wreck because of the rust and the iron. In a real limestone cave that's river formed, generally, and you'll notice I'm being like a lawyer with my answer to this question. Generally, it is a mitigable risk because of the circumstances of how it was formed and how it is replenished by the yearly activity of the cave.
That's a much more in-depth answer than I expected. Thanks very much. It's definitely sort of helped me out and understanding it. Mate, really, honestly, it's been quite an experience to listen to you talk for the second time, because obviously I listened to the interview on the other day. So it was much more than I expected from you. Thanks. And I don't mean I undervalued your value.
I get what you're saying. And it's been nice for me as well. Well, I'm quite unusual in that cave diving is my passion.
Yeah.
Most of my real expeditions have been in cave, not on wreck. I've done wreck expeditions as part of my work, but open ocean diving on wrecks and with marine life is my job.
Yeah.
And cave is my passion. I do it on my day off. I do it when I'm not being paid, and I'll do it forever in the capacity I'm capable of as I get older. I do both, because one's become my career, supervising archaeological projects for institutions, and one has always been my passion and always will be. That's
good.
Crawling around in muddy holes.
Love it. So I'm thinking of the JJ then. Do you think that'd be a good choice for the first rebreather?
Absolutely.
For long term, is that what you've got?
At the moment, yeah. I'm JJ, have been for the last 2 years. Pretty much, I was driven that way because gradually all my high-level student inquiries were, we dive JJ, can you train us? We dive JJ, can you train us? We dive JJ, can you train us? So I had to go that route from a business point of view.
Yeah.
All the scientific diving teams I currently supervise are on the JJ platform, so you have to supervise from the same platform as they're using. And it's simple, it's reliable, it's robust. And at the moment, one of its biggest factors is it's driven by shear water, which at this time is in control systems and reliability and readability and usability, as their tagline says. Powerful, reliable, and simple, and that's what it is. It just works, as they say, it does what it says on the tin.
But I already use the shear water.
Yeah.
I dive if I'm on back mount, it's a backplate wing and harness. So it's almost the same sort of setup as I'm used to, isn't it? With the same sort of readout.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a kind of given. And then to ask the questions I asked of Kieran, and get the answers as detailed as you've just given me about a different set of questions, I guess.
Yeah.
It was definitely the right one for me. I'm not going to lie. When I saw the price tag, I was like, "Ooh, that's a bit much." But you've got to get it.
To be fair, if you're buying new, they're all of the ones worth considering. And the only thing I'd add, which I'm sure Kieran mentioned when you chatted to him, is you're trusting your life to this. So whatever you get, make sure it's CE certified as a rebreather, because that means an extremely respected, very thorough set of tests have been done on it as a piece of life support, personal protective equipment, by somebody who's not biased, i.e. not the manufacturer. And there are numerous units with CE now. So not to turn this into just a pro JJ chat, there are numerous units. And also look around. You've done a lot of these Have a Brew podcasts.
Yeah.
Have a look around through the list of people you've talked to and do the math. Just see, well, how many are on type A, type B, type C, and I don't need to tell you, you'll start to see a pattern.
That's kind of what's brought me to that. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. I'll never try and pull the wool over anybody, but it looked good. That was the first one for me. It looked sexy. So that was the initial one. But because I was ignorant, Phil, I didn't really know what I was getting into. I knew enough about the system of it, the different size cylinders you can get, and the functionality of it. Yeah. But I didn't know what a BOV was. I didn't know this, that, and the other. And obviously, like a radial scrubber versus an axial one, I understand that now. I know what I'm looking for and looking at. And it just ticked everything for me. And obviously, knowing you do it, happy days.
Yeah, excellent. Okay.
All right, buddy. Have a good evening. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Look after yourself. Take care.
You too, buddy. Take it easy.
Bye.
So that brings us to an end of episode 26 with my friend Phil Short. Links to all the things we discussed are in the podcast notes. You've been watching Are You a Scuba Diver? Fancy a Brew podcast with me, Andy the Northern Diver. You can find more scuba related content on my YouTube channel, and the link is in the podcast notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. If there's someone or something you'd like us to discuss, let us know via the Facebook page. Thanks for listening. See you on the next one.